This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. This is episode 102 of the podcast, and the second in our new direction on innovation in international development and humanitarian aid. When you think about the Peace Corps, the first thing that comes to mind for most of us, after the slogan, the toughest job you'll ever love, is bright-eyed college grads in grimy clothing somewhere in the middle of nowhere, working with people who have what seems to be very, very little relative to the material wealth in the United States is known for. My point here is that the Peace Corps is not the first organization you think of when the term cutting-edge innovation is put on the table. Finding water and basic livelihood materials? Yes. 21st century technology and change at the pace of some of the best in Silicon Valley? No. But here's the thing. Peace Corps has had an Office of Innovation for almost 5 years now, and there's some very cool things happening. I wanted to talk about those cool things, and so I spoke with Patrick Choquette, who has served as the director of Peace Corps' Office of Innovation since 2012. He's the agency's second director of innovation, and he manages a small team within the director's office with the mission of empowering staff and volunteers with a work environment that breeds innovation. Now, as you've come to expect from guests here on Terms of Reference, Patrick is no slacker. In 2014, he was awarded the prestigious NextGov Bold Award for his accomplishments in creative problem-solving and innovation. And he has also previously served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ghana, an AmeriCorps VISTA volunteer, and a middle school educator. He was also one of the first field operatives hired in Iowa for President Obama's 2007 primary campaign. I spoke with Patrick in Washington, D.C. Hello, Patrick. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be on.
Patrick, where are you sitting? We're recording this in March of 2016. So where are you sitting today? Where do we find you?
So right now I am smack down in the middle of the Office of Innovation here at Peace Corps headquarters. We're located here in D.C. We have probably about 900 employees here at HQ. We are in the glass enclosed innovation space.
I can only imagine. So you direct the Office of Innovation at Peace Corps. I had no idea there were 900 people at headquarters. That's amazing. But you're under the director's office, right?
Correct. So we're about 5 years old now, and we are part of the director's office, and we are tapped to sort of go out and figure out how to, breed innovation within the Peace Corps, which is exciting in its freedom and then sometimes frustrating in the direction, just because you're sort of trying to figure it out as you go. But over the 5 years, we've been iterating towards figuring out how to do it better.
That's awesome. I love that you've captured that perfectly. It's there's freedom. You can basically do what you want, but then once you find something, how do you implement it? How do you get it out there? Let's dive right in. Can you give us a couple of examples today of what the Peace Corps considers innovations and maybe what you're trying to roll out to volunteers or to offices around the world? Or give us an example of what are the kinds of things you're putting out there and saying, hey, we can do things differently.
Sure. So first is to understand, we're doing innovation in a space that's sort of designed with a lot of traditional barriers to innovation. So we're sitting on top of a huge bureaucracy that includes all of our staff here, and then as well as all of our incredible country staff that within a country, who are then sitting on top of our volunteers, and then eventually who are working with our communities. So it's an interesting place to try to innovate, because you'd love to be there. Like when I was a volunteer in Ghana, you're right there on the edge where the innovation is happening. So actually implementing specific things is sort of a natural day-to-day occurrence. When you move up the ladder, now you start to think about how do you create environments that would encourage people to innovate? How do you direct policies? How do you manage risk? Those things. So the day-to-day tactics of it all, and actual innovations in the sexiest term of it, become less of our job and more about how do we create an environment that breeds innovation. Do
you guys have a policy of innovation?
No, we don't. And I think that maybe the most important thing is we have a definition of what innovation is. I think that may have been, maybe the most important thing we were able to do is really clearly define it within our organization of what innovation means, because everybody uses that term and they use it in different contexts and things like that.
And I'm going to have to ask you, what is your definition?
So our definition, what is it? No, I'm just joking. Our definition is innovation is the direct result of giving people the room to experiment. It is not a tool. It is not a particular practice, but it's more like it's a result of creating this environment.
Give us an example of how, we are lucky enough to have a couple of Peace Corps, not only volunteers, but also, people who are directing programs now, people who are even directing, countries at this stage. What kind of message, or how do you send a message out to them that says, you have the tether, you have the rope in order to experiment? What does that mean?
Yeah, so we think about the room, so we just break down this like room to experiment. So this is, I try to explain it too. I work a lot with managers, right? Because managers are the ones that really can either make their environment within their direct reports or within their countries or within their programs. They have a lot of control, and they can either create this culture or they can kill this culture. So our managers across the world all have a lot of power. And so you define, say, hey, it's like, if you want to be innovative, you got to create this culture. There's no cheap way to get to it. And so I try to break it down. It's like, okay, so now within this room, like, what is this room to experiment? What's in that room? And I argue that one of the first things is autonomy. You got to give your people autonomy. And that means you got to give them your trust. You got to give them decision-making power. On a daily basis, they sort of have to, released from, I guess, the weights of getting every decision checked on. You really got to give them a lot of trust. And that's actually very interesting because that's how Peace Corps sort of is and why we are, I argue, the most innovative agency in the space right now, just because our volunteers have always been around this autonomy. My father, when he was a Peace Corps volunteer in Pakistan in the 60s, I think he talked to his supervisors or, within Peace Corps, once or twice over 2 years.
I was just going to say, that's like the classic model of Peace Corps is that you're kind of put out in the field and it's like, all right, we'll check up on you sometime, right?
Yeah. And that is similar to when I was a volunteer 2005, 2007, we're by definition in these places that make it difficult for traditional supervisory methods. And so the default of that is that the volunteer has a lot of autonomy, and which I think is huge in terms of giving people the opportunity to be innovative. The second part of this, what I argue now, is like, okay, yeah, you can just leave them alone and you're going to get a lot done, actually. The other thing that's sort of interesting, I think it's becoming more and more available, is like, can you give individuals real-time data on their things? So really you want this environment in which you as an employee or you as a Peace Corps volunteer have the freedom to try out these things, but you have a clear vision of where you want to go, and you have like almost a real-time score of how you're progressing. So therefore, when you try something, you can quickly find out if it helped or not, and either keep going with it or maybe more importantly, just kill it because it didn't work very fast. So that data, I think that real-time data is the thing that we're seeing easier to do these days. And that's what I work with a lot of managers on, is like, how can you provide data to people so they know the direction that they're going? It's very simple, and they can start to make tweaks and adjustments to their work performance and make that number go up.
Give us a specific example. Is there something that is either happening in the field or at the managerial level right now that has bubbled up and is exciting, that either tackles this real-time data issue that you were talking about, or is just a new innovation that everybody's like, "Ooh, this looks really cool"?
So I'll talk about one of our main projects that we're sort of incubating here within the Ops Innovation. And so I'll take the long route to this because I think it's all sort of very interesting. So our model is we put volunteers out in the field, then we have this 3-month training in country. We teach them the language, we teach them a lot of hard skills, we teach them cultural. Really, this 3-month of what we call pre-service training in country is what separates us, I think, from a lot of organizations. And so this time with the volunteers is obviously a very valuable piece of time, just because we're trying to teach them everything we possibly can so they're ready for and most prepared to be of use to their community as they go and live with them for 2 years. So as director of innovation, I stepped in and I was like, oh yeah, we got these great innovations. We need to teach our volunteers how to do it in PST, in pre-service training. The problem is they're just logistically, there's not very much time to teach somebody a local language from maybe nothing, and teach a new culture from, very little understanding. Takes a lot of time. And so those 3 months fill up very quickly with those things. So the room and time to talk about innovation really just gets deprioritized a little bit. Not because they don't think it's important. It's hard to argue that language and cultural training is...
Sure, there's a couple other things that are a little more important right at that point.
Yeah. So we said, okay, what about the time in between which a volunteer sort of applies to Peace Corps, they get accepted, they know they're heading off to a certain country, so a volunteer is going to head out to Benin. Could we take advantage of the time that they're sort of here in the U.S. and haven't really left yet? That's not a new idea. There's lots of people who try to think about this, but what we struggled to do was we would hand out resources and things to them. However, just like every sort of online class right now, it's really easy to get that stuff out there. It's really hard to get people to actually finish it. And it's actually really difficult, even as someone who wants to take those courses. Like raise your hand if you've taken a online course and did not finish it.
Sure. Yeah.
Even though you want to be doing these things, it's just very difficult to keep motivated in things. So the problem that we had was like, okay, well, how do we help motivate people in the pre-departure environment is what we call that. So in that time before they leave, how do we motivate them? Because that seems to be the actual problem. Not that the content isn't there, not that they don't have the time. It was more about like, how do we start motivating them? And the problem in the past is we sort of give them things and then we'd sort of ask them when they got to training, did you do them? And they say, yeah. Or they say, sort of. But that yeah and sort of didn't, it's already over. We can't learn from that. They're already in country and we sort of did it. And so we really said, okay, actually the first thing we have to do is figure out how to measure this stuff, how to track it so that we can hold people accountable to it and maybe, actually adjust our motivational tactics. So we took the major chunk of, again, our goal here was to try to free up some time. We took on language training, which is a huge part of all of our pre-service trainings. And we started to work with the language learning app Duolingo. Are you familiar with Duolingo?
I've seen it, I've heard of it, but I've never used it myself.
Duolingo is just it's a new language learning app, very, very popular. In fact, extremely popular. Probably about 150 million users. And they have a business plan that is based off of making money in a different way so that the app can be free. And so we actually worked with their business manager, and they were working on a project to try to bring Duolingo into the classroom. And they took advantage of like kind of the latest thought in like flipping the classroom and everything. And they created this dashboard. So this dashboard is just a kind of a real-time flow of how much practice people are doing. Long story short, we started off with just, Duolingo would send us over like a Excel spreadsheet of kind of the user metadata, so we could kind of actually find out if we put this goal of practicing, for an hour and a half a week, were volunteers actually doing it. And lots of iterations later, there's a program that's free. It's open to everybody. It's called schools.duolingo.com. And we use that program to actually see in real time the language practice that's happening with the volunteers. And now we have this for every given class of volunteers that are heading out to a country. We have a real-time data on how much they're practicing. And so we can try out different motivational techniques and find out what works.
Wow, you took me in a place where I did not expect us to go. I mean, you're innovating to improve the Peace Corps program itself, right? Most of the time when we think of innovations, it's how do we innovate to improve the lives of, quote unquote beneficiaries or the people that we're serving at the end of the day. But that's fantastic. That's an internal process. How long has that been going on and what kind of results have you seen? Are people showing up with good language skills now, or do you still have a pretty, for lack of a better term, like essentially a smorgasbord of people who are motivated about getting a language done?
So I think so we've been going at it's got about a year and a half now through this program. And
give us a sense of how many batches would that be around the world within that year and a half?
I think it's a total of about, and so we had to focus on languages that were on the platform, so that we really started focusing on Spanish, just because it was, something that we teach a lot of. Spanish, French, we now do Ukrainian, Portuguese. So we've had about close to 2,000 Peace Corps invitees go through the program. And where we first started off, we were only getting about maybe 10 hours of practice out of them. We are now up to close to nearly 40 hours of practice. And that's over about a 10-week span. So we've really, again, like with this data, we've really just started experimenting. Like, what's the proper length? Do you start them right away, 6 months before they go? Do you start 2 weeks right before? Like, we really just use this data to just tinker to figure out where to optimize for. And we've settled into this about a 10-week program that ends about a week before they leave. And we focus. I think maybe the most interesting thing is like you have these assumptions, and I think that's like probably the hardest part about it. Everybody has these assumptions, and the assumptions are what get people excited and they want to try out. And we first start off with like, we do all these little challenges and like little contest things and
gamification.
Totally. And try to get the volunteers to sort of maybe, sort of compete against each other. That's like a natural thing that sort of happens. And it was effective to a certain extent. But the nice part about it is that we knew to the extent what that meant, because we had this like very rich data. We knew that, we were getting down to like the minute or even second of how long people are practicing. So we didn't just say, oh yeah, that worked. We don't ask that question anymore. We don't say, did that work or did that not work? It's all relative. Like, how much did that work? How much did that improve off of the other thing? And that's only possible when you have this like really, really great data. So where we're at now is really interesting. Like, we've abandoned a lot of the little contests and other, we used to send them a care package if they got to a certain level of amount of practice or things as a group, and sort of abandoned that. And we've actually found out that having them post, this is sort of random, but this is where you get to a place you don't expect.
Hey, but this is Freakonomics, right?
Yeah. The most effective way to get people to practice Duolingo is actually not talk about Duolingo. And it makes sense in retrospect, but we're finding them posting videos of themselves speaking in Spanish to a Facebook group that they're all sort of a part of is probably the most efficient way to get them to practice. And it makes sense. You create this, you kind of pull off of their desire to want to talk, get to know each other in the pre-departure. They're all very curious about these people they're going to do. They also don't want to look stupid in front of all these people. So they practice.
I was going to say that the performance anxiety alone has got to be intense. Just take me down that little trail right there. So for the Facebook groups, I'm trying to connect it back to your office. Your office isn't big enough, obviously, to run these programs. And so you came up with a partnership with Duolingo. You sort of banged down it a little while and tested it. And then it's now rolled down into the program level. And I'm just trying to think about, how does this even get implemented?
The interesting thing is there was some resistance, as all with every change.
What? Resistance in a large bureaucratic organization? I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, no, it's shocking. And here I argue we have less than most places, but it was actually healthy. The resistance was healthy because it forced us to, the bearer of evidence, or I guess the burden of proof lies on the innovator, I think. Even though our current practice had anecdotal data on what works. And again, like, it's more than anecdotal. We've been doing it very well for 55 years. This new level of data just wasn't possible back, not that long ago.
Not even 3 years ago.
Yeah. And I argue that each class that goes through, it's drastically different just because, everything's changing so rapidly. So we get a little bit of resistance, so we didn't get a lot of buy-in to take over this workload. So it actually we had to do it ourselves to prove it out. And so that meant we had one individual who was going to be in charge of running this program with 1,000 people. And so that meant we had to be incredibly efficient. And it created this great pressure to get rid of absolutely any, down to the minute of like this person's workload to try to get it to happen, because until we had big enough data to prove it out, people were not going to buy into it. So I was a little bit upset that we didn't have, we had these initial results, but the program is better for the fact that we've actually had a person in the Office of Innovation who ran it. And the return on investment in terms of all that stuff is really great because we're getting all this work out of, one employee. But now we're getting to the point where the data is just so undeniable, and it's been kind of become part and parcel of this thing that the countries are it's just become the normal thing. So we don't have to do the change. We're not battling the change process of it. It's sort of like we're just figuring out how to implement it better.
So would you think that now you've opened up an interesting piece, and this is where I'd like to go with this, that so basically you came up with an innovation, it was there, you guys could smell and taste it, that this is going to be something that was really important, but you kind of got buy-in, but you already had the leeway and as the Office of Innovation to test these things out. But you couldn't get support from the program. And so you hired, or you basically said, look, this one person in the office is going to do this. Is that how it's going to happen for every innovation that you guys have come up with? Or is that the case for everything that you've worked on thus far? That it's kind of like we've got to prove it first and then roll it out and we get no support? Or have there been other cases where that's been totally different?
There's definitely some things that are a lot easier to implement. It's really hard to say because part of you says, oh man, like sustainability wise, of course we got to get our 15 employees that are looking at pre-departure, like we got to get them doing it. But this one is really interesting because that was kind of our goal right off the bat. Our goal right off the bat was to do this program and have it run decentralized within all the countries. That was our original goal. And sort of an unintended consequence of it has been we have centrally have this run. We have the ability to share the data with all these countries, so they don't actually have to. They are benefiting from all the data, but they don't have to do the day-to-day work of it. But I think the super unintended benefit is that when you centralize it, you actually get more chances for iteration. So we have more cycles. So like if a country, like volunteers are going to Colombia, if it was run decentrally, they would only have maybe 1 or 2 cycles a year. Whereas this one, we've now gone, since it's centralized, we get to go through multiple cycles because we get the Colombia cycle, we get the Paraguay cycle, all these things are sort of back to back, and the person gets to look at all that data across the board. And so we sort of stumbled into that, and it's sort of helping it better. And then all of a sudden you look up and you realize that every single invitee going to a Spanish or French speaking country is actually going through the program. Mm-hmm. So you start to wonder, what does implementation actually look like? And I'll be the first to admit, we haven't figured this exactly out yet. We do know that it is implemented. Now it's all about like how we optimize for sustainability. And then we also think about if we optimize for agility as well, because the lifespan of these technologies is so short. You don't want to spend 2 years attempting to set it up for sustainability in the sense of, like we don't want to spend all our time implementing, very specific things about Duolingo because we want to move to the next thing the moment that it exists. So it's a weird tension that I battle with a lot. I don't know the correct answer to a lot of these things. That's sort of what we're trying to figure out now is like, does this, how much do you invest in traditional, what people would call sustainability or moving it within the programs on these things that move so quickly? Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense. I mean, trying to keep up with the pace of technology is, first of all, we all know it's impossible, right? But secondarily, I mean, you've got a gigantic global, an organization that has a global reach. We will be talking about this lost in this series. I'm sure is that when you have a large organization like this, implementing even the smallest change there's a huge cost factor. There's a rollout factor. There's a training factor. There's a rebranding factor. There's, you can go down that list, and that's what every big organization has a problem with. That's why a lot of times you see small, agile organizations competing well with big organizations because they are exactly that. They're small and agile and can move, right?
Yeah, this is sort of where I'm coming around to in the last year or so, is this concept of, normally the Ubers of the world, these small startups, they beat out these big ones. This is just sort of like the phenomenon of disruption within business, right? The interesting is that there isn't really a competitor to Peace Corps, right? So there's not, in terms of like, they're not competing for the same funds as us. Mm-hmm. And so in a sense, I sort of think of it as like, okay, is the Office of Innovation the small startup that is trying to beat out the big company? And I don't want to create it as if it's like a big tension, but it's sort of like we had to manufacture this sort of atmosphere that exists in the private sector, where things are competed against each other. But here it's like, since there's nobody for us to compete against, we had to create this competitor from within. Does that make sense?
Makes absolute sense. And that's, you're monopolistic in a certain sense, right? Because you're the only U.S. government organization I know of that has your line item, right, in the budget. Yeah. But, there are other volunteer programs. There are, obviously a lot of faith-based initiatives that are volunteer. You're competing yourself for people who are interested in your program and who want to come in and that kind of stuff. But then internally, you don't have to compete for your budget line item other than with Congress, et cetera. So showing that you're better, faster, cheaper isn't necessarily always where your money's best spent, right, or your time.
Yeah. It's a tough thing because we obviously, I argue that Peace Corps is a huge, wonderful ROI on taxpayer dollar. But our budget has been similar for a long time. And so if we're not getting that pressure, if we're not getting cut or increased all these things in that sort of funding budget is not our pressure. Can we create the pressure to innovate from within?
Absolutely.
And that's sort of where we're getting at now, where it's like we actually, Office of Innovation, we think about like, can we work with these people under clear understanding? So I like work with the language people, and it's not covert or anything like that, but it's like we are going to try to actually change everything so that the demand for the old services sort of becomes less, so that they can actually move to the new ones. We want to actually outcompete our own, within our own organization.
Sure.
So that we can just do it more efficiently. And it makes it easier for the traditional resources to then move. Because as long as there's a demand for what they're doing, it's very difficult to kind of rip that out. So it's almost like you have to steal demand and help in that transition.
How much have you learned in that sense? You've been in the position, I think, 3 years now. Is that right? 3.5?
Yeah, 4.5 years here in the Office of Innovation.
Okay. So how much have you seen that type of internal demand for services or evolution, to use that term, change just over the nature of the typical volunteer at this stage? Again, I've been lucky enough to, my wife's a Peace Corps volunteer. My parents were Peace Corps Georgia a couple of years ago. When my parents were in Georgia, they had a fiber optic network cable that was put into their house. The volunteers we know of today, they all have smartphones. There's sort of an expectation and demand for the ability to communicate and those kinds of things. How much is that the natural evolution of technology and communications and those kinds of things? Can you ride those waves? Can you use that as sort of surfing points or what?
Absolutely. And that, how's the Office of Innovation with, our 5 individuals in this office? How do we compete with the other 900 employees here at Peace Corps? Is we are fierce early adopters of this stuff. Mm. So we want to take advantage. Because that's the new tool out there is, these communication technologies. And so we are very quick to move to them, and we recognize that there's huge, huge advantages to that. And so that's how we can run a language. Duolingo has allowed us to run a language training program for 2,000 individuals with one person. The traditional method that doesn't take advantage of these like absolute latest and greatest in technologies. You just don't have the efficiency to do it. And so, yeah, so I agree. It's like, this is what allows this to happen. This is what's changed recently. This is the ability for a small office within an organization, or even a volunteer or a country. They can just go out and sort of like use these free services, these freemium services. They don't have to have this huge investment that we traditionally would have. And so now they can actually compete, and they can actually make the move themselves without having to convince the cruise ship or the cruise liner of Peace Corps to actually move in that direction. They can kind of do it on their own. And then we as an agency, is a huge opportunity, I think. We can then look at all those, figure out who's actually.
Do you have people? Do you have a place where people can just sort of call it the innovation hotline or whatever you want, where they can post what they're doing or show what they're doing, and then basically that's your big data dump, your big source for, oh my gosh, look at all these cool things. Does that exist right now?
We tried that. We abandoned that. And now we failed fast on that. And now there's the other interesting thing is like the volunteers are all so much more connected online, blogs, social media, Instagram. We can actually go to these places and harvest.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So you're just scraping. That's great.
Yeah. We're taking the burden off. The volunteers doing enough. Like I feel like, we got the time here to go. We'll go search them out. And a lot of times, the beauty of this stuff is if you're out there on these platforms and engaging with these volunteers, you start to be the most informed in terms of what's actually happening on the ground. Like I argue our social media team and within our communications, which has traditionally been a recruiting, mechanism. All of a sudden you start going to them for what's the latest on the ground. Like what's the absolute, what are volunteers doing? What's working with them? Like, and it's all about, do you engage with these places? So we've definitely transferred from a concept of, hey, send us your innovation, because we realize the incentive for that is not as where it needs to be. And we move towards, hey, there's a major incentive for them to talk about these things online because they want to share it with their friends and their counterparts. They also want to communicate it back home. We just go harvest it. That's our shift.
That's awesome. That's a smart shift to hear about. That's fantastic. Give us an example. So we talked a lot about the Duolingo piece. What else is in your portfolio of what you're looking at right now? I mean, you talked about, are there other things that are pre-service training? Are there things you're looking at to reduce dropouts, keep people safer, make them more effective?
Sure.
What else is in your portfolio?
So another very interesting project we are taking on, the Ebola crisis hits. And I don't know if people are familiar with OpenStreetMap, but OpenStreetMap is just a completely crowdsourced and open geographic information database.
We'll include links to OpenStreetMap and the blog post.
Perfect. So Ebola crisis hits, and there's a massive movement towards all these aid organizations are coming in. This is this is obviously a global threat. And so there's all hands on deck, and people are going in and trying to get on the ground epidemiology, basic stuff happening. And they realize that they don't have, an accessible data set of geographic information, especially in these very, very rural areas where there hasn't been the economic incentive of a Google or another private company to go in and build out this data. It's very interesting because we were part of it. We mobilized a lot of people to go in, and really what we did here is take direction from the people on the ground and say, hey, we need this area just kind of like mapped out. And what that means is basically tracing satellite imagery. And then they got this base data that then they can go around and do things with. But this crowdsourcing happened, and it happened very quickly, and there was much, much urgency because they just got to get this data to them as fast as possible. Stepping back after that, I sort of felt in my mind, I was like, man, we have, actually one of our evacuated Guinea volunteers was actually coming to work in our office. We were just talking about how much we've already mapped a lot of these places. Peace Corps has been in these countries, and us and our counterparts have actually done a lot of mapping just because it's a great tool to, needs assessment and integration, all these things. But existed in a database that was a paper, maybe a volunteer notebook, or maybe it's in a cabinet of a NGO somewhere, or in a cabinet of Peace Corps. And it wasn't, even though the data existed, it wasn't available when we needed it as a global community. So we started to think about, it's like, man, what if it's very simple. What if we, instead of put it on paper, we put it into this database that is accessible to everyone? This sort of basic, implementing a worldwide change of, hey, as a volunteer and you're putting this public information that belongs to the community and you're working with the community, put in a database that the community can access. So that sort of started off, and now again, this sort of information is, sort of what buildings are, where's the schools at, where are the, really any piece of data that is relevant to the community, but creating on top of that this foundational digital platform so that you can, in these communities, you can use this information the way that we all do here in the United States. We kind of take this for granted that you can Google where's the nearest Starbucks, and you can not only order it, but
thank you for using Starbucks. Is that thank you very much.
But you can get a direct route by bus, by car, by bike, and all of that is due to this immense amount of just baseline data that exists. So could we target the creation of some of this data so that the app developer in that community could use this to create the next Waze, or whatever they do they need it for their hospital routing? Do they need it for epidemiology, like tracing back to where outbreaks are happening? Could we as Peace Corps help catalyze the creation of this data and then put it into a place that's complete? Long story short, we've been going at this and figuring out how best to kind of train up and market and make this change. Peace Corps is now, in the last probably about a year and a half, we're well over 3 million edits to OpenStreetMap in areas in basically volunteer communities, and supporting major country interventions. For example, Madagascar, they're distributing 11 million bed nets within Madagascar, and to track where those are at, where they're being used, where they should go, and sort of how you distribute that many resources. We've worked with them, the volunteers there in their communities, to map 17 of these communities completely, which is hundreds of thousands of edits each, to create this data that can be used to enhance or monitor or to evaluate and maybe just make more efficient a distribution of 11 million bed nets. That's just one example. They're doing it.
I wish that we had, another 2 hours to talk about whatever, your entire portfolio. I know we don't have that. I've got 3 more questions though.
Sure.
What, you talked earlier about Peace Corps had a fairly consistent funding stream, or I guess the number, right? The amount of money the Peace Corps gets has been fairly consistent over the last several years. What about your office? How do you ultimately fund this innovation? Are you given a budget and do you have to go out and argue for more when you find something that's cool, like the Duolingo thing? How does that happen? Can you go out and can you bid for other funds, or?
Yes and no. I mean, we have strategically tried to do things without a lot of funding.
That's pretty classic small organization innovation, though, right? And I mean that's a little tongue in cheek, but isn't that where so many of the greatest innovations have come from, right? It's like, how can we do this for free, basically? Because if we can do it for free, then somebody will pay us $1 billion to do it too, right?
I agree with that 100%, and I feel like it's a nice pressure on us, and I don't think it was a conscious choice. I think we were actually trying to get more resources, and they weren't coming. And then we realized that we got to prove ourselves out. And then we sort of realized that it actually is and it actually works. I mean, like volunteers, if we're going to come up with an innovation, it cannot cost a lot of money, honestly, because then if so, the community can't use it. And that's who our main client is. and I'm talking about the communities in which we serve around the world, like if we came up with this like amazing, application that was the silver bullet that saved everything on your mobile phone, if it's not free, it's going to be very difficult to distribute and get people to actually use it. It's a natural thing within our organization. That's the kind of the great room to experiment that exists is actually limited monetary resources. We take care of we take advantage of other resources, and that's just sort of the Peace Corps way. You don't have these communities don't have a lot of disposable cash, but they do have a lot of people who can work on these things and a lot of time. And so we try to work in the same thing. We fund innovations with our own time. We fund these sort of innovations in a non-traditional way, like maybe a group here within Peace Corps wants to do something. Instead of giving them money, we might take on some of their risk. So we might say, hey, we'll pilot this. It's going to work, but you can't, you don't want to like invest a ton of money in it right now. We'll go in and we'll take it under the guise of the Office of Innovation, and we'll absorb a lot of that risk. So that's actually the resource that they need, not the money per se.
And that's you kind of go back to that trust issue. That kind of people know the boxes they need to check, they know the forms they need to fill out, and jumping off that cliff that's the scariest part sometimes.
Mm-hmm. It may be that we start to fund things a little bit differently, but so far I like the idea of keeping it nimble and very lean and scrappy. That's a core tenet of our Stomp Out Malaria program. They like literally call it, we're going to be scrappy. We love that. And that we feel like that's Peace Corps. That's how Shriver wanted it to happen. That's how our community members are. That's how our volunteers are. And we're going to act the same way.
Is there a innovation that you could think of either, I'd love it if it's in the last 4 years or so that you've been directing this office, but any time within Peace Corps that is now just standard ops. It could be as simple as, the use of mobile phones, SMSing, to check in with people. But is there something more recent where you're like, what? We thought this was total cutting edge, 5 years ago, but now it's a no-brainer and everybody uses it, or it's actually become ingrained in policy?
Definitely the use of SMS. It's definitely something that, I don't know if we decided to do that, but it just became such a thing. It's happening right now with these chat apps like WhatsApp. It's just becoming in Facebook Messenger, anything that sort of works in these communities. Like we just sort of started taking advantage of them, and we never made the decision to do it. It's just, we're just following our community's lead, and they're doing it, and that's where our volunteers are. And so definitely that, I think in terms of technology, one of the major things that we've been successful in utilizing is radio. That a lot of our volunteers use that. It's still a very common information dissemination tool within the places where we serve. So I argue that that's another thing that we've it's just become more standard practice now to use the radio to disseminate trainings and information. Going back a little bit farther, I think so when my father served in the Peace Corps, they trained at Colorado State. So this concept of we're going to train you in the United States and then we'll drop you off in your community. We adjusted, and a huge innovation there was we moved to these community-based trainings. And that's sort of become completely what everybody does now. It just makes so much sense. Put the volunteer right away into the situation so they start learning, and that makes our training so much more effective, so much more relevant. And they have so much more context, and their language adaptation is so much, better too, because of this concept of, complete immersion, throw them into the fire. And then you have this kind of incubated 3 months where you're living in the community, but you're still going to all these trainings. And that adjustment, I think, has made our training way more effective.
I'm really glad that you brought that last one up, because again, I'm sure you see this all the time, but I've seen it around the world myself, where whenever you say the word innovation, everybody starts thinking of mobile phones and apps and technology and programming. But sometimes an innovation can be the slightest change in how you deliver a program or the timing of a program or anything. And as you said, just that decision to say, let's actually just train people in the country rather than before. That was a pretty big decision, but it profound effects, right? Profound sort of trickles across the entire organization. Last question I have for you is one that I hope everybody in this new thread of innovations is going to help me geek out on. But you yourself, who is it that you're paying attention to right now when you think of cutting edge innovation, bleeding technology, or bleeding cool stuff? And this is your chance to name names, name other organizations, name individual people who you think are really out there, forward thinking, cutting edge. Are there individuals, organizations, people, blogs that you pay attention to?
Absolutely. I like to lead with it's so amazing because here at Peace Corps you're exposed to so many. We have this the majority of our staff are host country nationals who educated and grew up and are some of the most talented people that I've ever met, and those people are. I follow a lot of those people actually. What are program managers in Cambodia are doing are some. It's amazing, and that's. So I'll give a nod to that. That's a huge advantage that we have is we just have this network of highly, highly educated people from within these countries who are on our staff. And on that same vein, the Map Kibera project. So I'm pretty obsessed with this OpenStreetMap movement in general, but Map Kibera is a project in Kenya, and I look to them as a leader, as somebody who's this is within the community there, and Kibera is this big, huge slum outside of Nairobi that they're using OpenStreetMap data to improve their own lives, whether it be within schools and within elections and just raising awareness of the needs of their own people. I love what they're doing. I am also very obsessed with Louis Van On. He's the CEO of Duolingo. I think he's just doing so many just very, very smart things. Their mission is to provide free education to the world in terms of language, and they're figuring out a way to get a lot of people on it. And so I just love the way they're making decisions. They're using this technology and a blend of the technology and local knowledge about what the actual problems are to create this resource that's so valuable to so many people. So those are 2 point a lot, but that's sort of who I look to right now.
Patrick, this has been a fantastic conversation. Again, I wish we had another couple hours to talk, but we'll cut it off there. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, let's talk again. I'll tell you the other things we've failed quickly on and the adjustments. Hopefully we'll hopefully have iterated way into the future next time we talk.
We'll follow up with you in 6 months or so.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.